On the 8th of March, 1881, in a private address in Paris, a woman gave birth behind drawn curtains. There was no announcement, there were no flowers from Mayfair hostesses, no calling cards, no physician from the royal household. There was a bed, a room kept deliberately anonymous, and the sound of a city that had no idea what was happening inside. The woman was Lillie Langtry, the Jersey Lily, the face that had stopped traffic at the Royal Academy, the beauty whose portrait had required police to manage the crowds. 6 months earlier, she had been the most looked at woman in Britain. Now she needed desperately not to be seen. The baby was a girl. The father could not be named. The husband was somewhere else, drinking. And the Prince of Wales, whose attention had made all of this possible, was not in the room and could never afford to be connected to what had just happened in it. The public knew Lily Langtry as a sensation, the clergyman's daughter who had captivated a prince and become the most famous face in Victorian Britain. What the public did not know was that behind the portraits and the society columns, the marriage was collapsing, the money was gone, and the woman in those photographs was running out of ways to survive inside the world that had made her famous. This is the story of how she dismantled that world and built another one, converting beauty into commerce, scandal into profession, and royal notoriety into a fortune she controlled herself. It cost her a marriage, a husband's life, and a daughter raised inside a silence that would never fully break. It took 50 years, and it began in that Paris room. To understand how Lily Langtry arrived at that Paris room, 27 years old, alone, with a secret that could unravel everything she had built and everything she still needed, you have to go back to a place that could not have been less like Paris. You have to go back to Jersey. She was born Emilie Charlotte Le Breton on the 13th of October, 1853, at St. Saviour's Rectory, the residence of her father, the Reverend William Corbet Le Breton, Dean of Jersey. The rectory was solid, clerical, respectable, the kind of house that announced its occupants standing in the community without ever raising its voice. Jersey itself was a particular kind of place, British but not English, close enough to France to feel continental, small enough that everyone of consequence knew everyone else, and governed by social codes that were no less rigid for being applied on an island 7 miles across. The sea surrounded everything. The horizon was always visible, and yet the world available to a dean's daughter in the 1860s was remarkably small, bounded by the rectory garden, the parish, the expectations of clerical propriety, and the understanding that a well-bred girl's future would be determined not by what she wanted, but by whom she married. That world would shape everything Lily became. It would also become everything she spent her adult life escaping. She was the only daughter among the Le Breton children, and that distinction mattered more than anyone in the rectory could have anticipated. In a household of boys attached to a clerical father, Lily occupied a singular position, visible, indulged in certain ways, but never the heir to anything that could be passed down through title or profession. Her brothers would inherit their father's connections, his professional standing, the quiet machinery of clerical respectability that would ease them into adult lives of sufficient, if modest, purpose. Lily would inherit something different. What she inherited came from her mother. Emilie Davis Le Breton was remembered by those who knew her as a woman of striking appearance and social force. She moved through rooms with a quality that people noticed and did not forget. It was not wealth. It was not rank. It was the particular currency of feminine presence, the ability to change the temperature of a gathering simply by entering it. Lily absorbed that inheritance before she had any language for what it was worth. She watched her mother operate in the small theater of Jersey society, and she learned without being taught that beauty was not merely decorative, it was operational. It opened doors, redirected attention, created space where none had existed. That lesson would prove more durable than anything the rectory's moral vocabulary had to offer, and far more dangerous. Her father represented the other side of the inheritance. William Corbet Le Breton was a man of the church, positioned at the summit of Jersey's Anglican establishment. His authority was real within the island's social hierarchy. The deanery carried weight, conferred social access, and located the family within a world of respectability that felt, from the inside, like permanence. He gave his daughter manners, social literacy, the confidence of someone raised near institutional power, and that particular quality of self-possession that comes from growing up in a house where the front door opens onto authority. What he did not give her, what he could not give her, was money sufficient to sustain a life beyond the island, or connections deep enough to anchor her in the metropolitan world she would soon enter. The dean's household was comfortable. It was not rich. That gap between respectability and resources would define the first crisis of Lily's adult life, and it would never fully close. There is something about that childhood worth sitting with for a moment. The rectory, the island, the clerical father, the beautiful mother, the brothers, the sea. It sounds idyllic, and perhaps in certain lights it was. But Lillie Le Breton was not a woman built for containment by her own later accounts, and she was a skilled narrator of her own origins, capable of adjusting the light on her early years depending on the audience and the decade. She grew up restless, physically active, preferring the company of her brothers to the domestic occupations expected of a dean's daughter, swimming, climbing, refusing the drawing room patience that was supposed to be preparing her for a life of genteel management. She was increasingly aware that the island's boundaries were not large enough for what she wanted. What she wanted at that stage was not yet fully legible even to herself, but the impulse was there, outward, upward, elsewhere, and it would not be satisfied by anything Jersey had to offer. The vehicle of escape arrived in 1874 in the form of Edward Langtry. Ned Langtry was older, apparently solvent, and connected to the world of yachting and maritime leisure that represented mobility and social reach to a young woman on an island. He was not brilliant. He was not dynamic. He was not, by any account that survives, a man who commanded attention when he entered a room. But he had a boat, and the boat meant passage. Off the island, away from the rectory, into the larger life, whose outlines Lily could see but could not yet touch. They married, and the marriage initially delivered on its implicit promise. It took her off Jersey. By 1876, the couple had taken a house on Eaton Place in Belgravia, London, the capital, the place where a woman with the right face, the right dress, and the right introduction could become someone the world paid attention to. But the marriage carried a flaw that would not reveal itself immediately. Edward Langtry was not as wealthy as his world suggested. The yachts, the social ease, the apparent solvency, these were surfaces, and surfaces in Victorian London were what people judged by. Underneath, the financial position was thinner, more precarious, less capable of sustaining the kind of metropolitan life that Lily was about to enter. That instability would compound across the next several years, quietly and then catastrophically, and by the time the real crisis arrived, Ned Langtry would be not a partner, but a problem. Financially unreliable, socially outpaced, emotionally stranded by a wife whose trajectory had left him behind long before she formally left him at all. He would spend the rest of his life diminishing, and his end, when it came in 1897, would be bleak enough to constitute its own quiet tragedy within the larger one. But that reckoning was years away. In 1876, on Eaton Place, the future still looked possible. What happened next was not, as Lily sometimes allowed people to believe, a matter of pure accident. Later biographers, Jane Ridley's work on the Prince of Wales is particularly sharp on this point, have argued that Langtry's ascent through London society involved a degree of strategic self-placement that the myth of the innocent Jersey beauty tended to obscure. The introductions that brought her into the right rooms did not materialize from air. Lord Ranelagh and Lady Seabright's salon operated as a kind of social clearinghouse, mixing aristocrats, artists, hostesses, and men of influence in configurations designed to produce exactly the sort of encounter that would follow. Lily arrived at that salon understanding, at some level, what she was doing. The finished script of her public story would always emphasize discovery over ambition, accident over design. But the record, read carefully, suggests a woman who understood that she had one exceptional asset and very little time in which to deploy it. The evening of the 29th of April, 1877, at Lady Seabright's gathering, was the moment the machinery engaged. Lily appeared in a simple black morning dress. The room was full of women in elaborate color. Silk, ornament, jewelry, the full visual armory of a London season. Lily wore black. Whether this was genuine mourning, calculated restraint, or instinctive self-presentation, the effect was immediate and total. She stood out precisely because she refused the visual noise everyone else was producing. She looked different because she looked simple, and simplicity in that context read as a kind of authority. Frank Miles, the artist, young, socially connected, and possessing an eye trained to recognize the kind of face that could become a commercial event, sketched her that evening. Miles was not a great artist in the historical sense. He was something more useful. He was a talent scout, a man who understood that a woman's face, rendered in the right medium and circulated through the right channels, could become an event in itself. His sketch of Lily moved through London's visual networks, salon walls, illustrated papers, the careful hands of photographers, with a momentum that no amount of drawing room charm alone could have generated. Within weeks, the dean's daughter from Jersey was becoming the most talked about woman in London. That speed requires context because it was not simply about one woman's face. The late 1870s were the age of the professional beauty, a cultural phenomenon peculiar to Victorian Britain, in which certain women of the upper and upper middle classes were reproduced, circulated, and consumed through photographs, illustrated papers, salon gossip, and Royal Academy portraits with an intensity that anticipated modern celebrity by decades. These women were not actresses, not courtesans in the formal sense, not public figures by profession. They were admired, displayed, and discussed as though their beauty were a form of public property. The culture that elevated them also constrained them. They were expected to be visible, but not autonomous, desired, but not desiring, looked at, but never seen to be looking back with any calculation of their own. And the same society that claimed to revere feminine purity devoured feminine display with an appetite it preferred not to examine too closely. That contradiction between the reverence and the hunger was the system Lily entered. She would learn to operate it better than anyone. The painter who sealed the transformation was Sir John Everett Millais. His 1878 portrait, exhibited at the Royal Academy, carried the title A Jersey Lily and fixed the nickname that would follow Langtry for the rest of her life. Millais was not a minor figure. He was one of the most celebrated painters in Britain, a former pre-Raphaelite, a future president of the Royal Academy, a man whose brush conferred cultural legitimacy on its subject, as surely as a title conferred social rank. His portrait of Lily did not merely record beauty, it manufactured it into a public object, reproducible, discussable, ownable, in the form of prints and penny reproductions. When the painting was shown, crowds pressed around it so thickly that police were called to manage the crush. A woman had become an image, and the image had become a phenomenon independent of the woman who sat for it. Lily, watching this happen, began to understand something that very few people in her world yet grasped, that an image once loose in the culture had a commercial life of its own. That understanding would eventually make her rich, but first it would bring her to the attention of the man whose proximity could accelerate everything and whose withdrawal could destroy it. Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, was born on the 9th of November, 1841, the eldest son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. He was created Prince of Wales in infancy and spent the next 6 decades occupying a position of exquisite frustration, publicly visible, dynastically central, socially powerful, and politically useless. Victoria, who never forgave Bertie for what she believed was his role in Prince Albert's death, a conviction rooted in grief rather than evidence, but no less implacable for that, kept her eldest son at a deliberate distance from the real work of monarchy. She did not trust his judgment. She did not admire his temperament. She did not intend to share power with him while she lived. The result was a prince with enormous social energy, considerable personal charm, a genuine appetite for pleasure, and almost nothing official to do with any of it. What Bertie did instead was build a court of his own. It was informal, glamorous, appetite-driven, and organized around rituals that included horse racing at Ascot and Goodwood, country house weekends, where the guest lists were curated with diplomatic precision, elaborate dining theater, and the company of beautiful women whose presence was understood, managed, and never publicly acknowledged. His liaisons were conducted within a framework of discretion so practiced that it had its own unwritten protocols, its own officers. Francis Knollys, his private secretary, managed the logistics of royal indiscretion with the efficiency of a military campaign, and its own understanding of what silence cost and what exposure would mean. Princess Alexandra, his wife, beautiful, increasingly deaf, graceful in a way that commanded genuine public affection, maintained a posture of outward civility that concealed whatever private reckoning the arrangement demanded of her. The system worked as long as the manners held. The question that hung over every royal liaison was never whether it would happen, it was whether it would stay controlled. On the 24th of May, 1877, at a supper hosted by Sir Alan Young, the Prince of Wales met Lillie Langtry. The accounts vary on exactly what passed between them. What is not in dispute is the consequence. Within a remarkably short period, Lily became the woman most visibly associated with the prince. His attention functioned as a social accelerant of extraordinary power. A beauty who had been the season's fascination became, with Bertie's proximity, something closer to a national phenomenon. She was not merely admired. She was contextualized, placed inside the frame of royal desire, which gave her visibility a weight and a danger it had not previously carried. Court presentation followed. Public appearances together multiplied. The world around them performed its part with practiced fluency, treating the arrangement as though it were simultaneously obvious and invisible. For Lily, what followed was the most intoxicating and the most dangerous period of her life. Bertie's favor did not merely open doors, it abolished them. Invitations arrived that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. Hostesses who would never have received the wife of a marginal yachtsman now competed to seat Lily at their tables, because seating Lily meant the possibility of seating the prince. She was absorbed into the social calendar with a completeness that erased the distance between a Jersey rectory and a Mayfair drawing room as though it had never existed. Ascot cows. The country house weekends, where the real negotiations of Victorian power took place behind curtains of champagne and discretion. She was there for all of it, and her presence was understood by everyone who observed it as a statement about the prince's affections that required no verbal confirmation. The world they moved through had its own architecture of permission. A prince could not be seen to have a mistress in the way that a Parisian aristocrat might. But he could be seen to admire a particular woman, to visit her household frequently, to arrange his social engagements around her availability, and to treat her with a visible tenderness that communicated everything the court circular would never print. The women around them, the hostesses, the wives, the other professional beauties, understood the code and performed their roles within it. Princess Alexandra, whose own position was unassailable by title and public sympathy, received Lily with a civility that later generations would read as either extraordinary grace or extraordinary self-control. The arrangement worked because everyone agreed silently to make it work. The price of that agreement was that no one could acknowledge what they were agreeing to. For Lily, this was opportunity and peril compressed into a single relationship. Bertie's favor brought social immunity and a position of influence that no beauty, however striking, could have achieved on the strength of appearance alone. But it also made her dependent on a man whose attention was, by temperament and by precedent, temporary. Bertie moved between favorites with the regularity of the social calendar itself. The women who preceded Lily knew this. The women who would follow her, Daisy Warwick, Alice Keppel, others whose names the next decades would make famous, knew it too. The question was never whether the favor would end. It was what would be left when it did. And for Lily, the answer to that question depended entirely on what she could build while the light was still on her. Among the figures circling that light, Oscar Wilde occupied a position of particular significance. He was young, so only a year older than Lily, ambitious, theatrical, and already constructing a public persona as deliberately as she was constructing hers. In 1878, Wilde was not yet the playwright and controversialist the next decade would make him. He was a young Irishman out of Trinity and Oxford, brilliant, conspicuous, and engaged in the project of making himself into a kind of living artwork, a man who understood the personality, curated and performed with sufficient conviction, could function as a career. He saw in Lily what the rest of fashionable London preferred to admire without analyzing. A woman whose gift was not merely beauty, but the ability to perform beauty, to make it legible across a room, a portrait, a photograph, and eventually a stage. They recognized each other in a sense. They were both self-inventors operating inside a culture that preferred to believe its hierarchies were natural and its glamour was effortless. Later accounts credit Wilde with encouraging her toward the theater, and whether that encouragement took the form of a single sharp conversation or a sustained persuasion matters less than its content. The idea that what she was doing in drawing rooms for free could be done before paying audiences for money. That idea would prove to be the most important one anyone ever offered her. Henrietta Labouchere belonged to a different part of the apparatus entirely. She was practical, where Wilde was visionary, connected to the working theater rather than the salon. And she would become the person who coached Lily through the grueling transition from phenomenon to performer. Henrietta tested her in amateur performance, corrected her stagecraft, and helped bridge the enormous distance between being looked at and being watched, between the passive spectacle of beauty and the active labor of holding an audience. That distinction mattered. It was the difference between what Lily had been and what she was about to become. The transition would not be effortless. It would require rehearsal, embarrassment, failure, absorbed and converted into practice, the willingness to submit a famous face to the judgment of a paying audience, an audience that had standards beyond fascination, would prove to be one of Lily's most formidable and least appreciated qualities. She built fast. The household at Norfolk Street in Mayfair, and later at addresses that tracked her upward trajectory through the capital's social geography, became a node of considerable intensity. Artists visited and decorated the walls. Flowers arrived in quantities that suggested not domestic taste, but public tribute. The Prince of Wales came and went with the ease of a man accustomed to treating other people's drawing rooms as extensions of his own. The social calendar that organized London's elite, Ascot, Cowes, Goodwood, the country house circuit, absorbed Lily as though she had always belonged. And the speed of that absorption was itself a testament to what Bertie's proximity could achieve. She was present where it mattered. She was seen by the people who decided what mattered. Crowds gathered when she appeared at public events. Photographers competed for sittings. Her clothes were discussed and copied. The jersey dress she favored, close-fitting, practical, a garment that suggested the body beneath it with a confidence the crinoline generation would have found alarming, became fashionable precisely because she wore it. She was not following style. She was generating it. And her face, through Millet, through the portrait photographers, through the penny press and the illustrated weeklies, had entered the wider culture with a penetration that was new in its depth and its speed. She was becoming, in a sense that the Victorians did not yet have a clean word for, a celebrity, a woman whose image circulated independently of her physical presence, whose name was recognized by people who would never meet her, and whose likeness could draw a crowd at a gallery or sell a newspaper on a stand. And celebrity, she was beginning to realize, had a commercial dimension that polite society preferred not to acknowledge, but that she could not afford to ignore. In 1882, Piers Soap paid Lillie Langtry for a testimonial, her face, her name, her implied endorsement attached to a product and distributed to a mass audience. It was one of the earliest celebrity advertising arrangements in modern commercial history. Brown's Iron Bitters followed. Trade cards carrying her image circulated widely, turning her likeness into a purchasable promise about beauty and refinement that had nothing to do with whether the buyer would ever see her in person. Her face was becoming a commodity, with a market value independent of her physical presence. For a woman raised on clerical respectability and married to a man whose finances were quietly collapsing, the discovery that recognizability could be sold, not in the old ruinous sense, not as a courtesan's transaction, but as a modern commercial exchange conducted in daylight, was transformative. It would prove to be the single most important insight of her career, and she grasped it years before most of the culture around her had any framework for understanding what she was doing. But the glittering architecture was built on foundations that were already failing. Behind the Ascot afternoons and the carefully orchestrated social visibility, the structure that supported Lily's position was coming apart along every seam. Ned Langtry was drinking more and enjoying less. His money was running short in ways that could no longer be concealed by a dress alone. The financial structure that had supported the household, never robust, always dependent on the assumption that a man who lived in Mayfair must possess the means to do so, was hollowing out beneath him, and every season that passed made the gap between appearance and reality harder to maintain. His wife was the most discussed woman in London, and he had become, in the eyes of everyone who observed the situation, a man tolerated rather than required, present in the household because removal would cause a scandal, useful only in the sense that a married woman attached to a prince needed a husband to make the geometry of discretion function. That is a particular kind of humiliation, to be necessary as a fiction and irrelevant as a person, and it was destroying him by degrees. The man who had once represented escape and possibility to a restless dean's daughter was becoming something closer to furniture, visible, functional in a narrow structural sense, and increasingly ignored by everyone in the room who mattered. Ned's trajectory from this point would be one of sustained, quiet collapse, the kind of ruin that happens not in a single dramatic scene, but across years of accumulating irrelevance, drink, and the corrosive awareness that the woman who bears your name has become famous for belonging to someone else. The gossip was hardening too. By 1879, printed claims surfaced suggesting that Edward Langtry had named the Prince of Wales in a divorce petition. Whether this was true in its specifics mattered less than what it signaled. The affair had reached the point where letters, lawyers, and the threat of public exposure were no longer abstract risks, but operational realities requiring immediate suppression. George Lewis, the solicitor whose practice specialized in keeping the indiscretions of the powerful out of courtrooms, was involved. Francis Knollys was involved. The institutional machinery designed to protect royal reputation was engaged, and the machinery's engagement told its own story. Lily was no longer merely a beautiful distraction. She was becoming a liability. That reclassification from ornament to problem, from pleasure to risk, was the first structural collapse. The romance, whatever it had been, was being absorbed into the bureaucracy of scandal management, and beneath the institutional anxiety, beneath the social performance, beneath Ned's decline, and Bertie's careful withdrawal, something else was happening that nobody in the drawing rooms or the solicitors' offices yet knew. By 1880, Lily was involved with Prince Louis of Battenberg. Louis was 26 years old, a naval officer of genuine ambition, a member of the extended European royal network. His family connections would eventually place his descendants at the heart of the British monarchy itself. And he possessed the particular appeal of a man who was young enough, titled enough, and detached enough from the senior royal household to represent something Bertie could not. A relationship that was not a system. Whether what passed between Lily and Louis was love, infatuation, or the kind of reckless intimacy that emerges when a woman's primary arrangement is decaying and her emotional life is looking for somewhere else to go, the consequence was concrete. His presence proved that her world had moved beyond Bertie's orbit entirely. The royal affair was not a singular destiny. It was one thread in a more mobile, more dangerous, and increasingly uncontrollable existence. And by the end of 1880, that existence had produced a consequence that could not be managed by letters, loans, or the intervention of private secretaries. Lily was pregnant. The debts were pressing. The marriage to Ned was functionally finished. Bertie had lent her £2,000, not as a gesture of love, but as damage control, a sum intended to hold the surface together a little longer while the private reality behind it continued to disintegrate. The father of the child was almost certainly not her husband. The father was almost certainly not the Prince of Wales, though the ambiguity around that question would prove useful to the legend for decades to come. The most likely candidate, by the weight of modern biographical evidence, was Prince Louis of Battenberg. But likelihood is not certainty, and the uncertainty itself would become part of the story. A silence that would travel through generations, confusing family memory and stumbling through obituaries long after everyone involved was dead. That pregnancy changed everything. It was not simply a personal crisis, it was a structural one. The elaborate social architecture that had supported Lily's position, the discreet royal patronage, the tolerant hostesses, the photographers and painters and admirers, All of it depended on a set of unspoken agreements about what could be known and what must remain unsaid. A child born outside marriage, fathered by a man who could not be named, threatened to collapse the entire arrangement in a single season. British society had tolerated the affair because the affair had remained in its public presentation deniable. A child was not deniable. A child was evidence. And evidence, in a world built on the disciplined management of surfaces, was the one thing the system could not absorb. The question was no longer whether Lily could maintain her position. The question was whether she could survive losing it and become something else entirely. The woman London had treated as the prince's dazzling possession was about to discover that possession offered no protection. What came next would require something Bertie could not provide, something Ned had never possessed, and something no portrait, however beautiful, could substitute for. It would require work. And the kind of work she was about to undertake? Stepping onto a public stage, submitting her famous face to the judgment of a paying audience, converting notoriety into income, would scandalize polite society far more deeply than adultery ever had. The decision was not made in a single moment. It was assembled across the winter of 1880 and into 1881, built from smaller decisions that each carried their own weight of fear and calculation. The pregnancy had to be concealed. That was the first and most urgent requirement, because exposure would have destroyed not merely Lily's social position, but the entire apparatus of managed discretion on which it rested. A child born to the wife of Edward Langtry, fathered by someone who was not Edward Langtry, at a time when the wife of Edward Langtry was still publicly associated with the Prince of Wales, the permutations of scandal were almost too dense to navigate. Every path through them required secrecy, and secrecy required distance. Paris was the answer, not because Paris was forgiving in any moral sense, but because Paris was far enough from London that the machinery of gossip could be slowed, if not stopped. The journey itself had to be timed, explained, managed. A woman of Lily's visibility could not simply vanish from the social calendar without prompting exactly the kind of questions that the vanishing was designed to prevent. Excuses were constructed. Health was cited. Travel was framed as recuperation, as rest, as the kind of withdrawal that a woman of delicate constitution might reasonably undertake. The irony was bitter. Lily, who was by all accounts physically robust, whose childhood had been spent swimming and climbing in Jersey, was required to perform fragility in order to conceal the most vigorous evidence of her own body's life. By several accounts, Ned was managed, kept at a distance, informed or not informed depending on which version of later events one credits, but in either case functionally irrelevant to the decisions being made. This was not unusual. Ned had been functionally irrelevant to most of the decisions that had shaped their married life for years. But the pregnancy gave his irrelevance a sharper edge, because the child's existence raised questions about the marriage itself that could not be answered without destroying the very legal fiction. That Edward Langtry was the husband and therefore, in law, the father, on which the remaining architecture of Lily's respectability depended. The arrangements were Lily's to make: where to go, whom to trust, how to explain what was happening to the very small number of people who needed to know, how to construct around a biological fact that could not be denied, a story that could be sustained. That is a particular kind of labor, the labor of narrative under pressure, and Lily proved to be formidable at it. She had spent years watching a culture that ran on managed appearances. Now she was managing her own, and the stakes were higher than anything a salon evening had ever demanded. On the 8th of March, 1881, in Paris, Lily Langtry gave birth to a daughter. The child was named Jean Marie. The circumstances of her arrival were everything that Jersey Lily's public image was not: hidden, frightened, logistically improvised, and saturated with the kind of risk that no portrait or photograph could acknowledge. There was no announcement in the court circular. There were no visitors bearing flowers from Mayfair hostesses, no congratulatory cards from the world that had spent 3 years treating Lily as its most prized ornament. There was a room in a private address, curtains drawn against a city that had no particular interest in what was happening inside, and a woman whose entire adult life had been organized around visibility now requiring, desperately, to be unseen. Somewhere outside the room, In London, in Jersey, in the offices of private secretaries and solicitors, the machinery of reputation continued to grind. Letters had been written and intercepted. Arrangements had been made and revised. The distance between the Paris address and the drawing rooms of Mayfair was not merely geographical. It was the distance between two versions of the same woman, and only one of them could survive. What she felt in that room is not recorded in any way that a documentary can verify. What is known is the situation. She was 27 years old. Her marriage was finished in every sense except the legal one. The Prince of Wales, whatever private concern he may have felt, was no longer the organizing force of her life and could not afford to be seen organizing anything around the birth of this particular child. The most likely father, followed Prince Louis of Battenberg, was a young naval officer whose own career and dynastic connections made public acknowledgement impossible. He was 26, attached to a royal house that would one day place his descendants at the center of the British monarchy, and in no position to claim a child whose existence would have complicated his own trajectory beyond repair. And the child herself, Jeanne Marie, had arrived in the world carrying a question about her own identity that would take decades to resolve and would never be resolved cleanly. There is something about that detail worth sitting with. A child born into silence, a mother whose gift was the ability to be seen, now hiding, a father, whichever father, unable to stand in the room and claim what was his. The entire architecture of Victorian respectability, which had tolerated Lily's affair with the prince because the affair had remained, in its public presentation, deniable, now confronted with the one thing it could not absorb, a baby. Babies are not deniable. They grow, they ask questions, they develop faces that echo the faces of people who cannot afford to be echoed. They inherit the silences that surrounded their arrival, and those silences shape them in ways that the people who created them rarely anticipate. Jeanne-Marie would grow up under arrangements designed to protect reputation more than intimacy. The precise nature of those arrangements, who raised her in the early years, what she was told, how the gap between her legal name and her biological origins was managed, belongs to the murkier corridors of the family record, where later accounts contradict each other and certainty gives way to the kind of educated inference that biographers learn to handle with care. What is clear is that the child's existence represented for Lily both the deepest private consequence of her public life and the most powerful motivation for what she was about to do next. She had a child who needed to be supported. She had debts that needed to be paid. She had a husband who could provide neither income nor stability, nor even the basic social cover of a functioning domestic arrangement. She had a former royal lover whose patronage was fading into the background hum of court memory, and she had a face that the entire country recognized. The question was whether that face could earn. The route to the stage had been prepared, in a preliminary way, before the birth. Oscar Wilde's encouragement, Henrietta Labouchere's coaching, the amateur performance that had tested Lily's nerve and found it, if not polished, at least intact. But the distance between an amateur trial before sympathetic friends and a professional debut before a paying London audience was enormous, and the obstacles were not merely technical. They were social. A woman of Lily's class and connections did not, in the understanding of polite society, work for money on a public stage. Acting was a profession. Professions were for people who needed to earn. And the admission that one needed to earn, for a woman who had been painted by Millet, courted by a prince, and received at court, was itself a form of exposure more destabilizing in some respects than the affair had been. The coaching with Henrietta had been practical, unglamorous, and essential. It had stripped away the assumption that stage presence and social presence were the same thing. They were not. A woman who could command a drawing room through beauty, dress, and the silent authority of royal association could not command a stage on those qualities alone. The stage required voice, projection, control, the ability to fill a theater with sound that reached the back rows without becoming a shout. It required movement, not the studied grace of a ballroom, but the exaggerated, deliberate physicality that reads at a distance under gaslight. It required timing, which is the most difficult of theatrical skills, because it cannot be taught through instruction alone. It has to be absorbed through repetition, failure, and the slowly developing instinct for when an audience is with you and when it is not. Lily submitted to this education with a discipline that surprised people who had assumed she was merely decorative. She was not decorating, she was training. And the training, while it would never make her a great actress, would make her a functional one, which was, given the scale of audience interest in seeing her perform, more than sufficient. That paradox is central to the story and should not be rushed past. Victorian London tolerated its sexual irregularity with a practiced, almost institutional fluency, provided the irregularity was conducted within the right social register and managed with the right degree of discretion. A prince could have a mistress. A society beauty could be that mistress. The hostesses would accommodate. The press would hint but not name. The solicitors would intervene when things slipped. The entire system was designed to absorb private transgression as long as the public surface remained undisturbed. But what the system could not absorb with the same ease was the spectacle of a woman of that world stepping out of ornamental dependence and into professional self-sufficiency. An affair was a private arrangement between individuals, conducted behind closed doors and discussed in whispers. A career was a public declaration of economic need, conducted under lights and discussed in newspapers. An economic need in a woman of Lily's position was an admission that the men around her had failed to provide, which made it, in the social vocabulary of the time, a far more unsettling disclosure than adultery. The affair had confirmed the system's power. A woman of beauty was desired by a powerful man, and the social order absorbed the transaction gracefully. The stage career challenged the system's premise. A woman of beauty was earning her own money, and in doing so, she was announcing that the social order had nothing to offer her, that she could not provide for herself. Lily made the disclosure anyway. She had no choice, and the absence of choice in this story is where the real courage lives. Not in the glamour, not in the romance, but in the moment when a woman whose entire world had been built on the attention of men decided to bet her future on the attention of strangers. In December 1881, at the Haymarket Theatre, she appeared as Kate Hardcastle in She Stoops to Conquer. She was 28 years old, her daughter was 9 months old and hidden from public knowledge. Her husband was marginalized and drinking. Her royal affair was over in every way that mattered except historical memory. And she walked onto a stage in front of a London audience that included, by various accounts, society figures, critics, curiosity seekers, and people who had come with the specific intention of watching a famous beauty fail. The atmosphere in the theater that evening was charged with something more complex than theatrical anticipation. It was the charge of social transgression. A woman of Lily's class and connections had never done this, had never submitted herself to the public commerce of professional entertainment. The audience was witnessing not merely a performance, but a boundary being crossed, and boundaries once crossed cannot be uncrossed. She was nervous. That much is acknowledged even in accounts sympathetic to her talent. The role of Kate Hardcastle requires comic timing, physical ease, and the ability to project warmth and intelligence simultaneously, none of which can be faked by beauty alone. Lily delivered a performance that was competent rather than revelatory, workmanlike rather than inspired, and carried more by the force of her physical presence than by any mastery of the actor's craft, but competence in the circumstances was sufficient. The audience that came to stare did not, for the most part, leave disappointed. They left having witnessed something more interesting than technical virtuosity. They had watched a woman reinvent herself in real time, under lights, for money, and the fact that she had not been destroyed by the experience, had not frozen, had not fled, had not confirmed the prejudice that beauty and talent were separate categories, meant that the experiment could continue. The reviews were mixed. They would remain mixed for much of her career. Even sympathetic later assessments acknowledged that Lily Langtry was never a great actress in the sense that the word implies transcendent craft. What she was, from the beginning, was effective. Physically commanding, vocally adequate, possessed of a stage presence that drew from the same source as her social magnetism, and willing to work at the mechanics of a profession that most of her social peers would have considered beneath them. The audience that came to stare did not, for the most part, leave disappointed. They left having witnessed something more interesting than technical virtuosity. They had watched a woman reinvent herself in real time, under lights, for money. that reinvention accelerated rapidly. Within months, Lily had formed her own company, a move that transformed her from an actress, accepting roles offered by others, into a producer, an organizer, a woman making business decisions about repertoire, touring schedules, casting, venue selection, and revenue. The speed of this transition suggests that the commercial instinct she had displayed with the peer's endorsement was not an isolated impulse, but a fundamental aspect of her intelligence. She understood, with a clarity that her background should not have permitted, that the entertainment economy rewarded control as much as talent, and that the person who owned the company captured value that the person who merely performed in it did not. She was learning, in effect, the same lesson that Bertie's world had taught her in a different register, that proximity to power is useful, but ownership of the mechanism is better. The British tour that followed the Haymarket debut was the first sustained test of that understanding, and it held. Audiences came, not always because the play was exceptional, and not always because the performance was revelatory, but because the event was irresistible. The Jersey Lily, the prince's former favorite, the woman from the portraits and the scandal sheets live in person. On a stage, you could buy a ticket to enter. There was something democratic about it, something that inverted the old hierarchy of display. In the drawing rooms, Lily had been visible only to those who could secure an invitation. On stage, she was visible to anyone who could afford the price of a seat. That inversion was more radical than it appeared, and Lily characteristically grasped its commercial implications before she fully understood its social ones. The marriage to Ned, meanwhile, was entering its terminal phase, not with the violence of a rupture, but with the slow, grinding inevitability of a structure that had lost every reason to stand. He had been marginalized by the affair, humiliated by the publicity, and outpaced by a wife whose trajectory had made his own irrelevance impossible to disguise. By the early 1880s, the couple were effectively estranged, bound by legal ties and social convention, separated by everything else. The addresses diverge. The pretense of a shared domestic life thinned to the point of transparency. Ned drifted further into drink, further into the particular kind of despair that belongs to people who understand clearly and without illusion that the life they are living has ceased to be their own. His financial situation, never robust, deteriorated into a dependency that was itself a form of humiliation. A man who could not support himself, let alone the wife, whose fame had made his inadequacy public knowledge. What makes Ned's story worth tracking, rather than dismissing as the predictable decline of an unequal partner, is the way it illuminates the cost of the world Lily was operating in. The same social system that tolerated a prince's mistress demanded a husband to make the arrangement legible. Ned was that husband. His function was structural, not personal, and the moment the structure no longer required him, the moment Lily's stage career provided an alternative source of income and an alternative public identity, he became surplus. The cruelty was not intentional, it was architectural. The building no longer needed the beam. His trajectory from this point would be one of sustained invisible collapse, ending in 1897 in circumstances bleak enough to constitute their own quiet devastation, a death that few papers noticed and fewer people mourned. But that ending was still years away, still accumulating behind the drawn curtains of a life that the public had long since ceased to watch. In 1882, the immediate reality was simpler and harder. Lily had a career, a concealed child, a failing marriage, debts that the stage income was beginning but not yet able to fully address, and a reputation that was transforming in the public mind from scandal into fascination. She was no longer the prince's mistress. She was becoming something the culture did not yet have a settled category for. A woman who had converted notoriety into profession, who had turned the gaze that had once consumed her into a commodity she controlled, and who was discovering, with each performance and each tour, that the commercial value of her name was not diminishing with distance from the royal affair, but increasing with distance from it. The further she moved from Bertie, the more she belonged to herself. And the more she belonged to herself, the more the public wanted to watch. Bertie himself, in this period, receded into the background of Lily's story, with the inevitability that characterized all his liaisons' endings. He did not disappear entirely. Later accounts suggest he remained on civil terms, that he attended early performances, that he continued to exercise a distant, avuncular interest in her welfare that may have included practical support as well as social acknowledgement. The relationship between a prince and a former mistress in that world was governed by conventions as elaborate as those that had governed the affair itself. One did not cut a woman one had loved. One did not pretend she did not exist. One maintained the forms, a nod at a public event, a discreet inquiry through a private secretary, the continued social acknowledgement that prevented the former favorite from being treated as though she had been discarded. And the forms, in Bertie's case, included a kind of residual benevolence that kept Lily within the outer orbit of his world, even as the center of that world moved on to other women, other favorites, other arrangements requiring the same discretion and the same institutional management that had attended the Langtry affair. But for the documentary's purposes, what matters about Bertie's recession is not the prince's behavior, but the woman's response to it. Lily did not collapse when the royal attention withdrew. She did not retreat into the private humiliation that the culture expected of a discarded favorite. She did not wait to be rescued, reinstated, or reattached to another powerful man whose proximity could restore her position. She went to work. And the work, against every social expectation and against a fair amount of professional skepticism, was succeeding. That success recontextualized everything that had come before. The drawing rooms now looked, in retrospect, like waiting rooms. The portraits looked like rehearsals. The years of royal proximity looked less like a destination and more like a phase. One stage in a longer journey whose true direction had not been visible until the woman at its center was forced, by circumstance and necessity, to reveal it. The child remained hidden. Jeanne-Marie was growing up inside arrangements that prioritized the management of reputation over the expression of maternal feeling. Arrangements made by a mother who was herself the product of a world in which feminine worth was measured by appearance, discretion, and the ability to maintain a surface under pressure. Whatever private grief or guilt that cost Lily, and it would be presumptuous to claim certainty about the interior life of a woman whose public presentation was, by design, a performance. The practical reality was that the child's existence could not be publicly acknowledged without unraveling the careful narrative that was allowing Lily to rebuild her life. A woman on the stage was one kind of scandal. A woman on the stage with an illegitimate child whose father might be a prince of the blood was another kind entirely. The concealment would hold for years. Its consequences would outlast everyone involved. Jeanne-Marie would grow up carrying a confusion about her own origins that later family accounts would handle with varying degrees of accuracy and evasion. In some tellings, she was raised to believe her father was the Prince of Wales. In others, the ambiguity was left deliberately unresolved, a silence shaped like a question mark around which the child was expected to build an identity. That silence, the silence a mother imposed in order to survive and that a daughter absorbed as the first and most fundamental fact of her existence, is one of the outline's most powerful long-running threads. It connects the Paris Room of 1881 to obituaries written decades later, in which the question of Jeanne-Marie's paternity still stumbles through the prose unresolved. The crisis that began with concealment never entirely ended, it merely changed form. By the middle of 1882, Lily was preparing for the step that would determine whether her reinvention was a local success or a transformation on a different scale entirely. She was going to America. Henry Abbey, the impresario, had arranged the tour. The American market was not merely an extension of the British one. It was a different economy of fame. Louder, less encumbered by the class distinctions that made Lily's stage career transgressive in London. More willing to treat celebrity as a straightforward commodity, and critically capable of generating revenue at a scale that British touring alone could not match. America did not know Lily as the dean's daughter who had married badly and loved above her station. America knew her as the Jersey Lily, the beauty, the scandal, the woman from the portraits, and America was prepared to pay to see her without the social reservations that complicated every London performance. The Atlantic crossing was not merely a journey between continents, it was a journey between systems of value. In London, Lily's stage career was a transgression. In New York, it was an attraction. She arrived in October 1882 to press attention that exceeded anything she had experienced in Britain. American newspaper operated under different constraints and with different appetites than their London counterparts. They were bolder, more personal, more willing to treat a celebrity's arrival as front page news, and more interested in the spectacle of a royal mistress turned actress than in the delicate question of whether she ought to have become one. The reporters met her at the dock. The interviews began immediately. Her clothes were described, her appearance was assessed, her history with the Prince of Wales was referenced with a directness that would have been unthinkable in the London papers. The public interest was not polite curiosity, it was commercial demand. The appetite of a culture that consumed celebrity with fewer scruples and greater enthusiasm than the culture she had left behind. On the eve of the New York opening, the theater burned down. It was the kind of catastrophe that could have ended the tour before it began. A fire destroying the venue, the sets, the carefully constructed infrastructure of a debut that the American press had already been building into an event. The logistics were in ruins. The schedule was wrecked. The company was stranded in a foreign city without a stage. A different woman, one less schooled in the art of surviving the collapse of arrangements she had depended on, might have taken it as a sign, might have retreated, might have returned to England with the tour's failure, as a confirmation that the stage had been a mistake and that her proper place was back in the drawing rooms, diminished and dependent. Lily did not retreat. She rescheduled without hesitation. She found another venue. She opened elsewhere, in a borrowed theater. And the audience that came was enormous, and the press attention was extraordinary. And the tour that followed, coast to coast, city after city, week after week of performances in theaters that ranged from the grand to the improvised, ended in profit. That detail matters more than almost any other in the outline. The tour ended in profit. The woman who had arrived in London 7 years earlier as the wife of a marginal yachtsman, who had risen through beauty and royal proximity, who had fallen through pregnancy and scandal, who had turned to the stage out of necessity rather than vocation, had crossed an ocean and proved that her name had commercial value independent of any man, any title, any drawing room, and any prince. The crowds came for the spectacle. They stayed because the spectacle delivered. And the money, American money, earned on American stages, deposited in accounts that no husband or former lover controlled, was hers. The significance of that fact cannot be overstated because it changed the fundamental equation of Lily's life. Before America, she was a woman surviving. After America, she was a woman earning. Before America, her value was attached to proximity, to Bertie, to the court, to the hostesses and painters and photographers whose attention had made her visible. After America, her value was attached to her name, and her name belonged to her. The distinction seemed simple. It was not. For a woman in Lily's position in the early 1880s, the transition from dependency to self-generated income represented a shift so profound that the culture around her did not yet have the vocabulary to describe it accurately. She was not a courtesan. She was not a gentlewoman living on inherited means. She was not a wife supported by a husband's fortune. She was a professional, and the profession was herself. America would bring her back repeatedly in the years that followed. Return tours, expanding audiences, deeper engagement with an economy that processed fame without the class anxiety that complicated everything in London. It would also bring her Frederick Gebhard, wealthy, American, sporting, and emblematic of the new world that was opening to her on the far side of the Atlantic. But that relationship and the property, racing interests, and California land it would eventually connect her to belonged to the next chapter of a story that was still, in the autumn of 1882, in the process of being rewritten. She had survived the first collapse. She had proved that the crowds who came to look at her would also pay to keep watching. What remained to be seen was whether survival could be converted into something more permanent, whether the stage income could become real wealth, whether the American success could be sustained across years rather than a single triumphant season, and whether the costs of what she had buried, the child in the first marriage, and the silence that connected them, would stay buried long enough for the conversion to hold. The conversion held. That is the simplest way to describe what happened over the next several years, and it is also the most important. Lily Langtry did not return from America and resume the life she had left behind. She returned and built a different one, larger, harder, more commercially sophisticated, and organized around a principle that the drawing rooms of Mayfair had never been required to articulate: that a woman's name, if sufficiently famous, could function as an asset class. The American tours continued, not as a single triumphant season, but as a sustained commercial operation. Return engagements, expanded routes, repeat audiences, the machinery of a touring company managed with increasing efficiency by a woman who was learning the business of entertainment from the inside. She crossed the Atlantic repeatedly through the 1880s and into the 1890s, and each crossing deepened her engagement with a country that offered her something Britain could not: scale without social penalty. In London, her stage career was always shadowed by the question of whether a woman of her background ought to be doing it at all. In America, the question was irrelevant. What mattered was whether the Jersey Lily could fill a theater in Chicago, in San Francisco, in Boston, in towns along the railroad lines that stitched together a continent whose appetite for spectacle was, by European standards, almost limitless. She could, she did. And the revenue that accumulated across those tours represented something more than theatrical income. It represented proof. Proof that Lily's commercial value was not a novelty effect that would decay with repetition, but a durable property that could be exploited across years, across continents, and across the shifting moods of a public whose appetite for her showed no sign of diminishing. The company she ran was her own. She was not merely the leading lady in someone else's production. She was the producer, the manager, the decision maker, responsible for casting, for repertoire, for scheduling, for the logistics of moving a theatrical company across thousands of miles of American territory, and for the financial outcomes that determined whether the operation survived or failed. The fact that she was a woman doing this work, in an era when theater management was overwhelmingly male, added a layer of difficulty that the surviving record tends to understate. Every contract negotiation, every venue booking, every dispute over billing or revenue required her to operate in a professional environment that was not designed for her and did not particularly welcome her presence. She operated in it anyway, with a combination of charm, tenacity, and commercial intelligence that left even unsympathetic observers acknowledging that whatever her limitations as an actress, her capabilities as a businesswoman were formidable. Frederick Gebhard arrived in her life during this period, and his significance was not primarily romantic, though romance was part of it. Gebhard was American, wealthy, sporting, and embedded in a world that operated by different rules than the ones Lily had learned in London. He was not a prince whose attention required institutional management. He was not a husband whose inadequacy would become a liability. He was a man with money, social confidence, and a set of interests: horses, property, the outdoor economy of American wealth, that intersected with opportunities Lily was beginning to recognize as her own. Their relationship, which would last several years and leave traces across the biographical record that later accounts handle with varying degrees of discretion, was important less as a love story than as a portal, an opening into the American world of land, racing, and investment that would eventually produce some of Lily's most significant and most durable assets. Gebhard introduced her to the culture of American horse racing, which operated on a scale and with a commercial directness that its British counterpart, for all its social prestige, could not match. He connected her to networks of wealth and influence that were not organized around monarchy or title, but around money, enterprise, and the straightforward proposition that a person who could generate profit deserved a seat at the table regardless of background. For a woman who had spent the first phase of her career navigating the elaborate social hierarchies of Victorian London, where everything depended on birth, connection, and the management of appearances, the American approach was liberating. It was also clarifying. In America, Lily did not need to be a prince's former mistress in order to be interesting. She needed to be successful. And success, in the American sense, was measured in the currency she was now accumulating: money, property, and the independence they conferred. That is not to say the relationship was coldly transactional. By several accounts, there was genuine feeling between them: affection, companionship, the particular intimacy that develops between people who share travel, risk, and the daily logistics of a life lived at considerable speed. But the documentary should resist the temptation to romanticize the attachment in ways that obscure its structural function. Gebhard was one more man in a life still shaped at its deepest level by the dynamics of dependency and exchange. The difference, and it was a significant difference because this was that Lily was now negotiating from a position of earned income rather than ornamental value. She was not being kept, she was being accompanied. And the distinction, though it might have looked subtle to an outside observer, was everything. The racing interest that developed during and after the Gebhard period became one of the most vivid expressions of Lily's transformation from dependent beauty to independent operator. Horse racing in the late Victorian and Edwardian world was not merely a sport, it was a social institution of the first order, a site where wealth, class, taste, and competitive instinct converged under conditions of high visibility, and where the hierarchies of British society were displayed, reinforced, and occasionally challenged. The great race meetings, Ascot Goodwood, the Derby, were events in the social calendar as much as the sporting one, and the owners whose colors crossed the finish line first enjoyed a form of public recognition that transcended the merely athletic. To own racehorses was to declare oneself a person of means and ambition. To own winning racehorses was to declare oneself a person of consequence. For a woman to do so, a woman with Lily's particular history, a woman who had arrived in the racing world not through inheritance or marriage, but through her own earnings and her own decisions, was to enter a domain traditionally reserved for men of title and fortune, and to enter it on the terms that could not be explained away as decorative or dependent. The horses were hers. The decisions about breeding, training, and racing were hers. The financial risk was hers. And the victories, when they came, would be hers too. Claimed in her own name, recorded in the racing calendars alongside the names of dukes and earls and industrial magnates, evidence that the Jersey Lily could compete and win in a world that had never expected to accommodate her. Lily's involvement in racing would deepen across the 1890s and into the new century, producing results that even her detractors could not dismiss. She registered her horses under her own name and campaigned them with a seriousness and a sustained commitment that distinguished her from the dilettante owners whose involvement in the sport was primarily social and seasonal. The stable was not a hobby or an affectation. It was an investment managed with the same commercial attention and competitive discipline she brought to her theatrical operations, and it would eventually yield victories significant enough to place her name in racing records alongside those of dukes and industrialists. The victories, when they came, would carry a symbolic weight that exceeded their prize value. Every win was evidence that Lily Langtry could compete and succeed in a domain that the men around her had assumed was theirs by right and by nature. The Gannett Valley Ranch in Lake County, California, which she acquired during the American period, represented perhaps the most literal conversion of glamour into capital in her entire career. The property was substantial. Thousands of acres of California land in a region whose climate and soil would later make it one of the state's notable viticultural areas. She took the fame that London and Bertie had given her, transplanted it to American soil, and used it to acquire something that would outlast the fame itself. Real property deeded in her name, generating income through agriculture that no prince, no husband, and no theater audience could revoke. The Langtry name would remain attached to the valley and its wine production long after the woman who brought it there was gone. A piece of Edwardian celebrity embedded in Californian earth, outlasting both the scandal and the glamour that had produced it. The ranch gave her something else, too. Something less tangible, but equally important. It gave her an American foothold, a basis for American residency and eventually American citizenship. That citizenship would prove to be one of the most strategically valuable assets she ever acquired, because it would give her access to American divorce law at the precise moment when she needed it most. When the old marriage to Ned had become not merely a dead arrangement, but an active impediment to the next stage of her life. Whether she foresaw that utility when she bought the property is impossible to say with certainty. What can be said is that Lily Langtry rarely acquired anything that did not in time prove useful. The pattern was too consistent to be attributed to luck. It was intelligence. Commercial intelligence, applied with a consistency that the men who had once assumed she was merely beautiful would have done well to respect. Meanwhile, the advertising enterprise that had begun with the Peers testimonial in 1882 was expanding into something more systematic. Lily had grasped earlier than almost any public figure of her generation that celebrity was not merely a social phenomenon, but an economic one. That a famous face attached to a product could transfer value from the person to the commodity in a way that benefited both. The Peers arrangement had been a single transaction, groundbreaking in its implication, but limited in its scope. What followed was closer to a strategy, a deliberate, sustained exploitation of her own image across multiple products and markets, conducted with an awareness of commercial dynamics that would not become commonplace among public figures for another century. Trade cards bearing her likeness continued to circulate through the 1880s and beyond, reaching audiences that her theatrical tours could not. These were not fine art portraits. They were commercial objects, items small, mass-produced, cheaply printed images designed to sell soap, patent medicines, household goods, and the vague promise of beauty and refinement that Lily's face had come to represent in the popular imagination. The distance between the Millais portrait at the Royal Academy and a trade card for Brown's Iron Bitters tucked into a packet of tea in a grocer's shop in the Midlands was vast. But Lily occupied both positions simultaneously, and that simultaneity was itself a form of commercial genius. She was both the painting and the product. She was the aristocratic beauty and the mass market image. She understood, before the advertising industry had developed the language to describe what she was doing, that the value of a brand lies not in exclusivity, but in ubiquity, in the ability to be present everywhere, at every level of the market, without ever losing the association with desirability that makes the presence valuable in the first place. She was not merely allowing her image to be used, she was managing its deployment with an intentionality that the culture around her had no framework for understanding. The word that best describes what she was doing is branding, but the word did not exist in its modern sense, and the woman doing it would not have used it. She would have called it survival. And she would have been right, because survival was what had driven her to it, and survival was what it continued to serve. Even as the survival grew, year by year, into something that looked less like desperation and more like wealth. By the mid-1880s, the diverging paths that had been implicit since the Paris birth were becoming visible enough to track individually, and the geography of Lily's London life reflected the change. She had moved from the Mayfair addresses of her years with Bertie to 21 Pont Street in Chelsea, part of the Cadogan hotel development, and the move itself told a story. Mayfair had been the territory of royal proximity, of borrowed glamour, of a social position that depended on someone else's willingness to sustain it. Pont Street was different, it was her own. It was the address of a woman who could sign a lease with her own money, furnish a house with her own earnings, and receive visitors or decline to receive them on her own terms. The blue plaque that would eventually mark the building as a residence was still decades away, but the life it would commemorate was already being lived. Each of the principal figures in the story was now moving along a trajectory shaped by the same original crisis, but heading toward a very different destination. Bertie continued on the path that had been laid for him since birth, the slow, steady, appetite-filled progression toward a throne that his mother showed no sign of vacating. Victoria was aging, but immovable, her grip on the monarchy as firm in her 70s as it had been in her 50s, and Bertie was aging too, his waist thickening, his patience thinning, his social calendar as full as ever, his liaisons continuing with the regularity and the institutional management that had characterized them throughout his adult life. Daisy Warwick had replaced Lily in the immediate circle of royal affection. Alice Keppel would follow, and Keppel would prove to be the most durable and the most discreet of all Bertie's companions, the woman who would still be at his side when he died. The pattern was Bertie's, and it did not vary. What varied was the women, and the fact that Lily had been one of them, perhaps the most publicly visible one, certainly the one whose afterlife would prove the most commercially productive, was becoming, for the prince, a matter of historical record rather than present concern. He had moved on with the thoroughness of a man for whom moving on was not merely a personal habit, but a professional necessity. A future king could not afford to be anchored to any one liaison. The machinery of discretion that surrounded him was designed to ensure that each attachment, however intense, remained ultimately disposable. For Lily, Bertie's continuing trajectory mattered primarily as contrast. The prince who had once been the center of a social universe was now a figure on the periphery, someone she might encounter at Ascot or at a theater, someone whose name still carried the echo of an association that had defined the 20s, but whose practical influence over her daily existence had diminished to the point of irrelevance. She did not need him anymore. That was the revolution. Not the affair, not the scandal, not the stage debut, but the quiet, cumulative fact that by the middle of the 1880s, Lily Langtry could support herself, employ others, invest in property, own racehorses, and make decisions about her own future without reference to any man's patronage or protection. The dean's daughter from Jersey, who had arrived in London with nothing but a face and a failing marriage, was becoming year by year something the Victorian social vocabulary struggled to accommodate: a self-made woman with assets, with ambitions, and with no intention of apologizing for either. Ned Langtry, by contrast, was vanishing. Not dramatically, not in a single catastrophic scene, but in the way that people vanish when the world they belong to has moved on and left them standing in a room that no longer has a purpose. He was drinking with the consistency of a man for whom alcohol had ceased to be a pleasure and become a necessity, the anesthetic required to get through days that offered nothing except the reminder of what had been lost. He was dependent on whatever residual income the marriage settlement provided, on whatever charity or tolerance the world extended to the husband of a famous woman, on the diminishing patience of people who had once found him agreeable company and now found him pitiable. The yachtsman from Jersey, who had once seemed like a gateway to a larger world, had become a man, defined entirely by absence. The absence of money, of purpose, of dignity, of any role in the life of the wife, whose name he still legally shared. There is a particular cruelty in Ned's trajectory that the documentary should not look away from. He was not a villain. He was not, even in most accounts, an especially bad man. He was an ordinary man who had married an extraordinary woman, and the mismatch had consumed him. The affair with Bertie had humiliated him publicly. The birth of Jean Marie had humiliated him privately. If he knew the full truth, and the record is not clear on the precise extent of his knowledge, though the absence of a divorce through the 1880s suggests that the fiction of paternity was being maintained, at least in its legal dimensions, because the fiction served everyone's interest except perhaps the child's. The stage career had made his wife independent of him financially, and his own resources of money, of temperament, of resilience, of the basic capacity to endure humiliation and rebuild were insufficient to sustain an alternative life of any dignity. What makes Ned's story worth tracking, rather than dismissing as the predictable decline of an unequal partner, is the way it illuminates the cost of the world Lily was operating in. The same social system that tolerated a prince's mistress demanded a husband to make the arrangement legible. Ned was that husband. His function was structural, not personal, and the moment the structure no longer required him, the moment Lily's stage career provided an alternative source of income and an alternative public identity, he became surplus. The cruelty was not intentional, it was architectural. The building no longer needed the beam, and the beam, unsupported, was rotting from the inside. His trajectory, from this point, would continue to darken. A long, slow descent toward a death in 1897 that would arrive with the exhausted inevitability of a structure that had been failing for 15 years, noticed by few papers and mourned by few people. That ending was still approaching, still accumulating behind the drawn curtains of a life that the public had long since ceased to watch. Jean Marie, meanwhile, was growing up. She was a small child through the mid-1880s, becoming a girl through the early 1890s, and the arrangements that surrounded her, who cared for her, where she lived, what she was told about her parents and her origins, remained deliberately obscure, wrapped in the kind of protective silence that families of this era deployed with practiced efficiency. Lily visited or did not visit with a frequency that the record does not clearly establish. The relationship between mother and daughter existed in a register that the public narrative could not acknowledge, and that the private one, shaped as it was by concealment and guilt and the competing demands of a career that required constant travel, could not fully sustain. What is clear is that the child existed in a zone of managed ambiguity. Legally the daughter of Edward Langtry, biologically almost certainly the daughter of Prince Louis of Battenberg, and raised in circumstances designed to prevent the question from being asked in public. That arrangement protected Lily's career and Lily's reputation. What it did to Jean-Marie, what it meant to grow up as the living answer to a question that nobody around you was allowed to ask and is harder to assess. And the difficulty of assessment is itself part of the story. Children absorb silence. They absorb the shape of the things that are not said around them, and they build their identities in the spaces that the silence leaves. Jean-Marie was building hers inside a gap that would never fully close. The silence that Lily imposed in 1881 in a Paris room with the curtains drawn was still operating. It would continue to operate for decades, and its effects would surface eventually in the confused family memories and contradictory obituary details that would attend Jean-Marie's own later life. Distortions in the glass through which her identity was viewed. Distortions that originated not in carelessness, but in the deliberate, strategic decision of a mother who chose survival over disclosure and paid for that choice with a relationship she could never fully inhabit. Through all of this, the American tours, the Gebhard relationship, the raising in property interests, the advertising arrangements, the quiet expansion of a financial position that was beginning to look genuinely secure, Lily continued to perform. She returned to Britain regularly. She toured the provinces, playing theaters in cities and towns whose audiences had read about the Jersey Lily for years and now had the chance to see her in person. She expanded her repertoire, taking on roles that stretched her technical range even if they did not always flatter it. Comedies, dramas, parts that required her to be something other than merely beautiful and present. The effort was real. She rehearsed. She worked with directors. She accepted criticism from people whose theatrical credentials exceeded her own, and she applied what she learned with the diligence of a woman who understood that her audience's patience, however generous, was not infinite. The critics continued to note the gap between her fame and her craft, and the notation had a particular consistency that suggests it was accurate. Lily was professional, competent, occasionally effective, and never transcendent. She lacked the vocal range and emotional depth of the great actresses of her era, women like Ellen Terry, whose talent was so formidable that it commanded respect independent of any personal narrative. Lily's performances commanded attention, which is a different thing, but attention, sustained across years and monetized with intelligence, turned out to be enough. The audiences came. They came in London, and they came in Manchester, and they came in New York, and they came in San Francisco, and the reason they came was not mysterious. They wanted to see the woman from the story of beauty, of a prince, of scandal, of reinvention, and was the product. The performance was the delivery mechanism. And Lily, who understood the distinction more clearly than anyone, continued to fill theaters regardless of what the critics wrote in the morning papers. She was also, by this period, beginning to think about theater not merely as a performer, but as a proprietor. The instinct for ownership that had driven her to form her own company and acquire California property was now turning toward the idea of managing a London theater, a fixed venue, a permanent operation, a base from which to control her own programming and her own revenue. That ambition would culminate in 1900 with her acquisition of the Imperial Theatre on Westminster Bridge Road, but the groundwork was being laid in the early 1890s, in the business habits and professional relationships she was building with each touring season. The dean's daughter from Jersey was thinking like a theater owner. The trajectory was, by any measure, extraordinary. By the early 1890s, a new set of questions was beginning to press. The American success was real, the financial position was strengthening, and the professional identity was established beyond serious dispute. But the old life, the first marriage, the legal ties to Ned, the unresolved question of Jean-Marie's status, the accumulated weight of more than a decade's worth of managed secrecy, had not been dismantled. It had merely been set aside, like furniture in a room nobody entered anymore, still occupying space, even though it served no purpose. And as Lily's circumstances changed, as her wealth grew, as her social position shifted from scandalous to formidable, as the possibility of a different kind of future began to take shape on the horizon of her middle years. The question of what to do about the old arrangements could no longer be postponed indefinitely. The problem was not emotional. Lily had moved past Ned years ago, in every way that mattered, and whatever residual guilt or pity she felt toward the man she had married was insufficient to sustain a legal fiction that had long since ceased to benefit anyone except perhaps the solicitors who managed it. The problem was practical. English divorce law in the 1890s was a system designed to make dissolution difficult, expensive, and socially punishing, particularly for women, and particularly for women whose personal histories included the kind of complications that Lily's did. The law was not merely restrictive, it was performative. It required the public staging of private failure, the airing of allegations, the presentation of evidence, the examination of witnesses in a courtroom theater whose audience was the press and whose reviews were published in the morning papers. A divorce in England would mean a public rehearsal of the very details that years of careful management had kept suppressed: the affair with the prince, the pregnancy, the child whose paternity could not be safely named. Ned was deteriorating further. The marriage was a legal fiction, sustained by inertia and the absence of a mechanism for ending it that did not involve catastrophic public disclosure. The child was growing older, and older children ask harder questions. Questions about surnames, about fathers, about the gap between what they are told and what they sense to be true. The prince whose shadow had once made the entire arrangement legible was receding toward the throne he would finally occupy in 1901. When Victoria died, and the man who had spent 60 years waiting finally became King Edward VII. His attention had long since been directed elsewhere, and his interest in the complications of a former mistress's domestic arrangements was, at best, residual. And Lily, who had spent the better part of 15 years building a new life on top of the ruins of the old one, was approaching the point where the ruins would have to be cleared. The old structure could not simply be ignored. It had to be demolished, legally, formally, and in a jurisdiction that would not turn the demolition into a public spectacle. She would need a courtroom, a continent, and the American citizenship that her California property had made possible. She would need to use the law of a country that processed divorce with less social violence than England did, and she would need to confront in the process the full cost of what had been done, not only to herself, not only to her career and her reputation, but to the man she had married when she was 20 years old and the child she had concealed when she was 27. The conversion of scandal into fortune was nearly complete. What remained was the bill. And the bill, when it arrived, would be paid not in pounds or dollars, but in the currency that Lily had been spending since 1881: silence, separation, and the permanent burial of the life she had lived before she learned to survive. The 1890s arrived, and Lillie Langtry entered them as a woman whose professional identity had long since overtaken the scandal that had produced it. She was in her late 30s, still beautiful by the accounts that survive, but beautiful now in the way of a woman who has worked for a living and carries the evidence of that work in her bearing rather than her complexion. The soft luminosity of the Millet portrait had given way to something harder, more defined, more intentional. She dressed with authority. She moved through rooms and through cities and through countries with the directional certainty of someone who knew where the money was and how to get there. The Jersey Lily of the late 1870s had been a phenomenon, produced by a combination of beauty, timing, and royal proximity that could not have been planned. The Lillie Langtry of the 1890s was an enterprise, and every element of that enterprise, the tours, the investments, the endorsements, the property, the horses, was the product of deliberate decision rather than fortunate accident. The theatrical operations continued to expand. She toured America repeatedly through the decade, returning to audiences whose loyalty had been tested by years of repeat engagements and found to be commercially durable. The logistics of these tours were formidable. Moving a theatrical company across the United States in the 1890s meant rail travel, hotel arrangements, venue negotiations, local press management, and the constant adjustment of schedules and repertoire to the demands of audiences whose expectations varied from city to city and season to season. Lily managed these operations with a competence that reflected years of accumulated experience and a temperament that was at its core organizational. She was not a visionary of the theater. She was an effective manager of a commercial operation that happened to take place on a stage, and the distinction, though it would have offended the artistic sensibilities of the era's great directors and critics, was precisely what made her successful. She understood that the entertainment business was, in the end, a business, and she ran hers accordingly. She toured Britain with the same relentless scheduling, playing the provinces with an energy that suggested not desperation, but calculation. Each performance a deposit into the account of a career that was now generating wealth rather than merely sustaining life. The repertoire broadened across the decade. She took on comedic roles and dramatic ones, society plays and period pieces, parts that required her to be charming and parts that required her to be formidable. If the critics continued to note the distance between her fame and her technical mastery, the audiences continued to close that distance with their ticket purchases. The relationship between what Lily could do on stage and what the public was willing to pay to see her do remained inverted. But the inversion was now so thoroughly established that it had ceased to be remarkable. It was simply how the Langtry economy worked, and worked it did, generating income that flowed into the racing stable, the California property, the London address at Pont Street, and the growing portfolio of assets that was quietly transforming the Deane's daughter from Jersey into a woman of independent means. She was also deepening her involvement in racing, with results that were beginning to command attention beyond the gossip columns. Her stable was growing in both size and quality. Her knowledge of bloodlines, training regimens, and the competitive dynamics of the turf was becoming serious enough that the men who dominated the sport could no longer dismiss her as a dilettante. Trading on notoriety, she was investing real money, her own money, earned on stages across 2 continents, in horses whose performance would be judged by the same standards that applied to the animals owned by dukes and earls and the Prince of Wales himself. The acquisitions were considered. The training was professional, the entries were strategic, and the results, while not yet producing the headline victories that would come later in the decade and into the new century, were consistent enough to establish her as a serious owner whose presence on the turf was a commercial investment rather than a social affectation. The racing world was one of the very few arenas in which Lily and Bertie still occupied the same competitive landscape, and the irony of that proximity, the former mistress and the future king, both watching their colors carried around the same courses, both invested in outcomes determined not by birth or title or the management of appearances, but by the brute democracy of which horse crossed the line first, was not lost on anyone who understood the history between them. The Imperial Theatre entered the picture in this period, though its full realization would not come until 1900. Lily had been thinking about theater ownership for years, the logical extension of a career that had already taken her from performer to producer to touring company manager. A permanent London theater would give her something the touring life could not: a fixed base, a venue she controlled entirely, a position in the theatrical establishment that went beyond the celebrity-driven economics of her own performances and placed her among the proprietors and managers who shaped what London audiences saw. The Imperial on Westminster Bridge Road would become that base, and Lily would manage it from 1900 to 1903. Selecting productions, hiring companies, managing finances, and confronting the reality that theater ownership in London was a far more demanding and less reliably profitable enterprise than touring had been. The results would be mixed: critical respect for the ambition, commercial returns that fell short of what her touring income had accustomed her to, and the eventual recognition that the building was costing more than it was generating. She would relinquish management after 3 years. But the attempt itself, the fact that a woman who had entered the theater as a scandal-driven curiosity in 1881 was, by 1900, managing her own London venue, represents one of the most extraordinary arcs of professional reinvention in the late Victorian entertainment world. The Dean's daughter from Jersey owned a theater in London. The fact that it did not last does not diminish the fact that it happened. But beneath the surface of professional momentum and accumulating wealth, the unresolved architecture of the old life was becoming harder to ignore. The marriage to Ned had been a dead arrangement for more than a decade, sustained by legal inertia, social convention, and the absence of a mechanism for ending it that did not involve the kind of public exposure Lily had spent her career avoiding. Every year that passed made the fiction more absurd and the need to end it more pressing. Lily was building a future that included the possibility of remarriage, of a new domestic arrangement that might offer stability without the suffocating dependencies of the first. The marriage belonged to the past, and the past left unaddressed had a way of contaminating the future in legal complications, in the lingering question of Jean Marie's status, in the simple practical fact that a woman who was not divorced could not remarry. And remarriage, as Lily was beginning to contemplate with increasing seriousness, offered possibilities that a dead first marriage permanently foreclosed. The gathering storm of the mid-1890s was not dramatic in the way that the Paris birth had been dramatic. It was administrative, logistical, and legal, the quiet machinery of dissolution, rather than the visceral crisis of concealment. But its consequences would be no less final, and the human cost, measured in the suffering of the man at its center, would be no less real for being largely unwitnessed. Ned was dying. Not in a single medical emergency, but in the slow, cumulative way that people die when the structural supports of their lives have been removed one by one and nothing is left to hold the weight. He was in his 50s now, a man who had entered middle age without the resources, the resilience, or the sense of purpose that might have carried him through the years that remained. He was drinking with the settled commitment of a man who had long since passed the point where alcohol was a choice rather than a condition, the daily anesthetic of a life that offered nothing worth being sober for. His health was failing in the ways that were visible to anyone who saw him, though fewer and fewer people did. His finances were non-existent in any meaningful sense. The apparent solvency that had once made him a plausible husband for a dean's daughter had evaporated long ago, consumed by the cost of a metropolitan life he could not sustain and the habits of a despair he could not escape. He was living in circumstances that bore no resemblance to the yachting life and the Belgravia dress and the social ease that had once made him seem like a gateway to a larger world. The decline had been so gradual, so thoroughly documented by its own invisibility, that by the time it reached its final stages, it had the quality of something that had always been happening, a trajectory so predictable that its conclusion felt less like an event than like the completion of a pattern established years earlier in the drawing rooms of Mayfair, when a wife's fame first began to outpace a husband's capacity to endure it. The world that Lily inhabited, and the stages, the stables, the California ranch, the London theater offices, had no room for Ned. And the world that Ned inhabited, the world of empty afternoons and unpaid bills, and the particular loneliness of a man whose own name had come to mean someone else, had no room for anything except the slow, attritional process of reaching the end. What Ned felt in those final years is largely unrecorded, and the absence of his voice in the historical record is itself a kind of commentary on the story's hierarchy of attention. The story belongs to Lily. The biographies are about Lily. The documentaries will be about Lily. The portrait that hangs in Jersey Museum is Lily's portrait. The blue plaque on the Cadogan Hotel bears Lily's name. Ned exists in these records as a figure defined entirely by his relationship to her, the first husband, the inadequate partner, the man who drank, the man who failed, the man who was there at the beginning and absent long before the end. That framing is not inaccurate, but it is incomplete, and its incompleteness is part of the cost. Somewhere inside the decline was a man who had married a woman he presumably loved, or at least desired, and who had watched that woman become someone he could neither reach nor rival nor leave. The humiliation was not a single episode. It was a condition, sustained across 2 decades, visible to everyone who knew them, and intensified by the particular cruelty of being married to someone whose fame made your own diminishment a matter of public knowledge, discussed in the same newspapers and drawing rooms that celebrated her ascent. Whether Ned deserves sympathy is a question the documentary should leave to the viewer. What it should not leave ambiguous is the fact that his suffering was real, that it lasted a long time, and that it ended badly. Lily, meanwhile, was preparing the legal ground for what had to happen next. The California property and the American citizenship she had acquired through residency gave her access to a divorce jurisdiction that operated with less social violence and less public exposure than the English courts. This was not accidental. The entire architecture of Lily's American investments, the Gwinnett Valley Ranch, the residency, the citizenship, had produced, whether by design or by the kind of fortunate convergence that seemed to attend her most important decisions, exactly the legal standing she now required. California law in the 1890s was more pragmatic, more straightforward, and less invested in the elaborate moral theater that English divorce proceedings required. A woman seeking a divorce in England was required to prove not merely that the marriage had failed, but that her husband had committed a specific, judicially recognizable wrong. And the proving was done in public before judges and reporters in proceedings that were designed to extract the maximum amount of private information and display it for public consumption. A divorce in Lakeport, in Lake County, near the ranch she owned, and on the basis of the citizenship she had acquired, could be conducted with relative discretion, far from the London press, far from the society columns, far from the institutional machinery that had once been deployed to protect the Prince of Wales from the consequences of his own appetites. The geography of the divorce was, in its way, as carefully chosen as the geography of the Paris birth had been. Both were acts of strategic distance, the use of physical remoteness to manage the social consequences of private facts. In 1881, she had gone to Paris to conceal a pregnancy. In 1887, she went to California to dissolve a marriage. Both journeys were undertaken alone. Both were conducted in relative secrecy, and both demonstrated the same essential quality that had defined Lily's approach to every crisis of her adult life: the willingness to travel far enough that the machinery of British social judgment could not reach her. On the 13th of May, 1897, in Lakeport, California, the divorce was granted. The setting was as far from London as the legal system could provide. Lakeport was a small town in Lake County, situated near the Gwinnett Valley property that Lily had acquired years earlier, and the courthouse in which the proceedings took place bore no resemblance to the ornate judicial theaters of the English system. This was California justice, pragmatic, procedural, and mercifully brief. The paperwork was filed, the grounds were stated, the judge ruled. And the marriage that had begun 23 years earlier on the island of Jersey, the marriage that had taken a dean's daughter to London, to Belgravia, to the drawing rooms of Mayfair, to the attention of the Prince of Wales, and through the most extraordinary sequence of reinvention in Victorian public life, was over. Lily was 43 years old. She had been married to Edward Langtry for more than 2 decades, and for most of those decades, the marriage had existed only as a legal document, a piece of paper connecting two people who had ceased to be connected in every other way that mattered. The grounds cited were sufficient for the jurisdiction. The proceedings were not widely reported in the British press, which was precisely the point. The discretion that Lily had sought, the same discretion she had practiced in Paris in 1881, the same instinct for distance and concealment that had governed every major crisis of her adult life, was, in its essentials, achieved. The most consequential legal act of her personal history took place in a California courtroom, thousands of miles from the world it most affected, witnessed by almost nobody whose opinion mattered in the London she had once conquered. What makes the Lakeport divorce the central reckoning rather than the Paris birth is a matter of emotional gravity and finality. The Paris birth was a crisis, sudden, physical, frightening, and survivable, because the woman at its center had the resilience and the intelligence to improvise her way through it. It was an emergency, and emergencies, however terrible, have the virtue of focusing the mind on the immediate. The divorce was something different. It was a settling of accounts. It was the moment when the accumulated cost of 16 years of concealment, separation, and managed fiction was finally calculated and paid, not in a rush of adrenaline, but in the cold, procedural language of a California courtroom. The marriage had not merely failed, it had been hollowed out from the inside by forces that had left nothing of the original structure standing. Lily's ambition had outgrown it. Bertie's attention had destabilized it. Prince Louis's presence had produced a child it could not contain. The stage had given Lily an economic identity that made the marriage's financial logic obsolete. And the American investments had given her a legal identity, a citizenship, a property, a jurisdictional foothold that made the marriage's legal dissolution possible on terms she could control. The divorce did not destroy the marriage. It acknowledged that the marriage had been destroyed years earlier and that the pretense of its survival was no longer useful to anyone. It was the removal of a ruin, the formal clearing of ground on which something else could be built. But ruins, even when they are cleared, leave traces. And the traces of this particular ruin, the confusion about Jeanne-Marie's legal status, the unresolved questions about paternity, the emotional damage sustained by a husband who had been consumed by his own irrelevance, would persist long after the California courthouse had closed its file and Lily had moved on to the next phase of a life that never stopped moving. And then Ned died. The timing was devastating in its symmetry. Edward Langtry died in 1897, the same year the divorce was finalized, as though the legal severance had been the last thread holding him to the world, and its cutting had released him into the decline that had been approaching for years. He was found, by the accounts that survive, in circumstances of considerable squalor. The details are sparse, as the details of ruined lives often are when the ruined life belongs to someone the world has already decided it is unimportant. He had been living alone, or nearly so. He had been drinking. His health had deteriorated beyond the point where recovery was a realistic possibility. The man who had married Lillie Le Breton at St. Saviour's in Jersey, who had brought her to London on the strength of a yachtsman's confidence and a solvent man's promise, who had watched his wife become the most talked about woman in Britain while he became the most pitied man in Mayfair, had reached the end that everyone who knew the story had been expecting for years. He died with nothing. Not nothing in the figurative sense that comfortable people sometimes use to describe reduced circumstances. Not the modest remains of a diminished fortune, not the thin comforts of a life lived below one's expectations. Nothing in the literal, unmetaphorical sense of having reached the end without the resources to sustain even the pretense of a life worth continuing. The wealth that had seemed real in 1874, when a yachtsman married a dean's daughter on a Channel island and the future looked like a drawing room in Belgravia, had evaporated entirely. The social position that had seemed secure, that had opened the door to Eaton Place and Norfolk Street and the salon of Lady Seabright, had collapsed under the weight of a wife's fame and a husband's incapacity. The marriage that had been his sole remaining claim to relevance, in a world that measured relevance by proximity to fame, had been legally dissolved on the other side of the world, in a courtroom he had probably never seen, under a legal system he had no connection to and no understanding of, at the initiative of a woman who had outgrown him so completely that even the act of leaving had been conducted at maximum distance. There is no neat moral in that ending. Ned Langtry was not destroyed by Lily's ambition, though her ambition contributed to his destruction. He was not destroyed by Bertie's attention, though the prince's presence in their marriage accelerated a collapse that might have happened anyway, but more slowly and less publicly. He was destroyed by the intersection of an ordinary temperament with extraordinary circumstances, by the simple, terrible fact that he was not equipped to survive the life that his wife's fame had imposed on him. Like a different man might have found a way to coexist with Lily's assent, might have built an independent identity, pursued his own interests, found a way to be married to the most famous woman in Britain without being consumed by the comparison. Ned couldn't do any of those things. And the world that had once accommodated him as an adjunct to Lily Langtry had no mechanism for accommodating him as anything else. He could only drink and decline and wait for the end that arrived when it arrived, with the terrible quietness of something that had stopped mattering to anyone except the man it was happening to. Lily received the news of his death from across the distance that had defined their relationship for years. The Atlantic, the continent, or simply the unbridgeable gap between a woman who was building a future and a man who had been unable to survive his past. What she felt is not recorded in any document that a biographer can cite with confidence. What she did is documented. She continued working. The tours did not pause. The performances did not stop. The contracts were honored. The schedules were maintained. The business of being Lily Langtry, the endless, relentless forward motion of a life organized around the principle that stopping was the one thing she could not afford to do, continued without visible interruption. Whether that continuity reflected coldness, discipline, grief buried beneath professional obligation, or simply the momentum of a life that had been moving too fast for too long to accommodate the kind of stillness that mourning requires, the record does not say. It simply notes that she kept going. And perhaps that is the most honest epitaph for the marriage itself. It had ended not with a scene of grief or reconciliation, but with the quiet recognition that one person's life had stopped and the other person's had not. The asymmetry was brutal. It was also, in a sense, the truest expression of what the marriage had always been. Two people moving at different speeds, in different directions, connected by a legal document and nothing else, until even the document was dissolved and the slower one fell. The year 1897, the year of the divorce and the death, stands as the hinge on which the entire narrative turns. It is the year in which the old life was finally, formally, irrevocably buried. Before it, Lily's reinvention was a work in progress, shadowed by the unresolved obligations and unfinished business of the marriage that had launched her and the scandal that had transformed her. After it, the reinvention was complete, or as complete as any reinvention can be when the costs have not been fully accounted for, and the people who paid those costs include a daughter who is still, at 16, asking questions about who she is and receiving answers that do not quite hold together. Jean-Marie was 16 years old in 1897. She had spent her entire life inside the arrangements that her mother's crisis had produced. Arrangements designed to protect reputation at the expense of clarity, to maintain surfaces at the cost of truth, and to defer the question of her origins into a future that was now arriving with the force of accumulated silence. The divorce removed the legal fiction of Edward Langtry's paternity, or at least destabilized it. Whatever the California court had been told, the dissolution of the marriage meant that the nominal father was no longer even nominally present. Ned's death removed a man who had served, however passively, as the figure around whom the fiction of a normal family could be loosely constructed. And the young woman who was left, no longer a child, approaching the age at which her mother had first arrived in London and begun the transformation that would define both their lives, was holding a question about her own identity that the adults around her had spent 16 years refusing to answer clearly. Whether Jean-Marie knew by 1897 that her biological father was almost certainly not the man whose name she had carried through her childhood is difficult to establish with certainty. The later family record is contradictory in the way that family records tend to be when the truth has been deliberately obscured. Later accounts suggest that she was raised with some version of the story, or some version of several stories, since the truth itself was multiple and contested. Different people remembering or claiming different things depending on what served their interests, their loyalties, or their sense of what a young woman ought to know about her own origins. In some tellings, she was allowed to believe that her father was the Prince of Wales, a grander, more romantic narrative than the likely reality of Prince Louis of Battenberg, but one that carried its own burden of impossibility, since a prince of the blood could not acknowledge a natural child without consequences that the entire system was designed to prevent. In other tellings, the ambiguity was left deliberately unresolved, a silence shaped like a door that opened onto several rooms at once, none of which contained a complete answer, and all of which contained some measure of pain. That ambiguity, that permanent, structurally maintained uncertainty about the most basic fact of one's existence, is the deepest cost of the story. It is the cost that Lily's later triumphs can never fully compensate, because it is borne not by Lily, but by the person least equipped to bear it, the child who had no say in the arrangements that shaped her life, and no power to change the narrative that was constructed around her. The conversion of scandal into fortune was real. The professional independence was real. The property, the horses, the theater, the investments, all real, all earned, all evidence of a reinvention so thorough that it deserves to be called extraordinary. But beneath them, running through the family like a fracture in the foundation of a house that looks solid from the street, was the unresolved question of a child's paternity, a mother's concealment, and the silence that connected them across decades and would continue to connect them long after both women were dead. The crisis that began in a Paris room in 1881 had never ended. It had merely changed form, from the logistics of concealment to the psychology of inheritance, from a mother's strategic decision to a daughter's lived confusion. from a biographical detail manageable by solicitors and private secretaries, to a generational wound that no amount of money or fame could fully heal. The pattern that would surface in later obituaries, the confusion about Jeanne-Marie's parentage, the contradictory claims, the stumbling attributions that could never quite settle on a single version of who her father had been, was already in place. It had been in place since the 8th of March, 1881, and nothing that had happened in the 16 years since had resolved it. It had only been deferred. The public would remember Lillie Langtry as the Jersey Lily, the actress, the horsewoman, the advertiser, the pioneer, the woman in the portraits. What remained to be seen, what the final chapter of her life would test, was whether the woman who had spent 3 decades converting scandal into independence could find, in whatever years remained, something that answered the question her career had never addressed, what it meant to have won, and what winning had cost the people closest to her, and whether any amount of triumph could outweigh the silence she had placed at the center of her daughter's life. 2 years after the divorce and the death, Lillie Langtry married again. The date was the 27th of July, 1899. The place was St. Saviour's, Jersey, the same parish where she had been born, the same church where the dean's authority had once defined the boundaries of her world, the same ground she had spent 25 years trying to escape, and to which she was now returning on terms that the dean could never have imagined. The groom was a Hugo Gerald de Bath, 19 years her junior, the heir to a baronetcy, and possessed of the particular quality that distinguished him from every other man in Lily's history. He was young enough and secure enough in his own prospects that the marriage could not be read as dependency. He was not rescuing her. He was not providing for her. He was not the vehicle of an escape she could not manage alone. Lily was 45 years old. She had survived a royal affair, a concealed pregnancy, a broken first marriage, a husband's death, a stage career built from scandal, and the slow, relentless work of converting notoriety into wealth. She was marrying again not because she needed to be married, but because she chose to be. And the distinction, after everything she had been through, carried a weight that no ceremony could fully express. Jeanne-Marie was present at the wedding. She was 18 years old, and her presence at St. Saviour's on that July morning is one of the most quietly loaded details in the entire story. The daughter born in concealment in Paris, raised under arrangements designed to protect reputation at the expense of intimacy, carrying a question about her own origins that had never been answered with the clarity she deserved. That daughter stood in the church while her mother married a man who was closer to Jeanne-Marie's age than to Lily's. The juxtaposition was strange, and the strangeness was compounded by everything the ceremony could not acknowledge: the father who was not named, the first husband who had died the year the divorce was granted, the prince who had made the whole trajectory possible, and who was, at that very moment, still waiting for the throne that would finally come to him 2 years later. What Jeanne-Marie felt standing in that church with that history pressing against the walls is not recorded. What is recorded is that on the same day at Goodwood, Lily's horse Merman won the Goodwood Cup. The coincidence was almost too perfectly symbolic to be believed, but it was real. While the private ceremony took place in a Jersey church, the public triumph took place on an English racecourse, and the two events juxtaposed told the story of Lily's second life more eloquently than any biography could manage. The woman who had been a prince's ornament was winning at the races. The woman whose first marriage had been a catastrophe was choosing a second on her own terms. The woman who had been born in St. Saviour's rectory was standing in St. Saviour's church, not as a dean's daughter, but as a self-made woman with property, income, horses, a theatrical reputation, and a future that she had built with her own hands. The Jersey Lily had come home, and home looked different from this side of the journey. Merman would go on to win the Ascot Gold Cup as well, a victory that placed Lily's racing colors among the most prestigious winners in the British calendar, alongside the colors of aristocrats and royals who had been bred to the turf, in ways that a dean's daughter from the Channel Islands had not. The racing triumphs were not incidental to the story. They were its most vivid expression. Every winner that carried Lily's colors across the finishing line was a small, public, undeniable proof that the woman who had been valued for her face could compete and win in a domain where beauty counted for nothing and only results mattered. The Imperial Theatre came next. In 1900, Lily took on the management of the theatre on Westminster Bridge Road, and for 3 years she ran it with the same combination of energy, commercial instinct, and stubborn determination that had characterized every professional venture she had undertaken. The results were uneven. Some productions found audiences, others did not. The economics of London theatre management were less forgiving than the economics of touring, where Lily's name alone could fill houses regardless of the material. A fixed venue required consistent programming, reliable casts, and a relationship with London's critical establishment that Lily, always more respected for her tenacity than her artistry, could not fully command. By 1903, she had relinquished management, and the Imperial passed to other hands. But the attempt itself was remarkable. A woman who had walked onto a stage for the first time in 1881, driven by debt and desperation, had spent 2 decades building a career formidable enough to support a bid for theatrical proprietorship in the capital. That the bid did not succeed permanently does not diminish its ambition. It simply confirms what the rest of the story already demonstrates, that Lily's reach consistently exceeded her circumstances, and that the reaching itself was the achievement. In 1901, Queen Victoria died, and the man who had shaped the most consequential years of Lily's life finally became king. Edward VII acceded to the throne at the age of 59, after waiting longer than any previous heir in British history. The coronation transformed a prince whose identity had been defined by social pleasure and private appetite into the monarch of the largest empire the world had ever seen. For Lily, the accession changed nothing in practical terms. The affair was 2 decades in the past. The relationship had long since settled into the residual civility of former intimates who had moved on, but it changed the meaning of everything that had preceded it. The man she had loved, or been loved by, or been used by, or used, the precise calibration depended on which account you read and which decade you were reading it in, was king. The prince whose proximity had made her famous was now the sovereign, and the woman who had once been his most visible companion was still on the stage, still touring, still filling theaters with audiences who came as much for the history as for the performance. The irony was quiet but total. Bertie had finally received the role he had been born to play, and Lily had long since stopped needing him to play it. Edward VII died on the 6th of May, 1910. He was 68 years old, and the reign that had lasted 9 years had been, by most accounts, more successful than Victoria's decades of disapproval had predicted. He had proved to be a capable diplomat, a popular monarch, and a man whose appetite for life, which had once seemed like a liability, had translated into a public warmth that the nation responded to with genuine affection. Alice Keppel, his final and most enduring companion, the woman who had succeeded Lily in the prince's affections and maintained her position with a discretion and a steadiness that Lily's more volatile career had never quite achieved, was at his side when he died. Lily was not. She had not been at his side for 30 years, and the distance was appropriate. Not bitter, not dramatic, simply the natural consequence of 2 lives that had diverged so completely that even the death of the man who connected them could not bring them back into alignment. Bertie's death closed a chapter that Lily had already closed for herself decades earlier. Whatever she felt, grief for a man she had once known intimately, nostalgia for a period of her life that had been both exhilarating and destructive, the complex emotions of a woman in her late 50s reflecting on a relationship that had defined her youth and been irrelevant to her maturity, she expressed with the characteristic restraint that had long since become her public mode. The Jersey Lily did not mourn the king in public. She had spent too long building a life independent of him to collapse back into his story at the end. The later years settled into a pattern of composed self-curation that was itself a kind of performance, the final role in a career that had never really stopped being one. Lily continued to act intermittently through the 1910s, taking engagements that allowed her to maintain the professional identity she had spent decades constructing. The stage career that had begun as desperation had become, by now, something closer to habit. An identity she returned to because it was hers, because the audiences still came, even if they were smaller, and because the alternative was to stop. And stopping for a woman who had been in motion since 1877, was not a skill she had ever cultivated. She spent increasing amounts of time in Monaco, where Villa Lillies became her principal residence, a house on the Riviera, elegant and maintained with the care of a woman who had spent her life understanding that surfaces mattered. Monaco suited the woman Lily had become: cosmopolitan, warm, moneyed, still socially active, still recognizable to people who remembered the story, but no longer required to justify her presence through performance or explain her history through discretion. She was Lady de Bath now. Hugo had inherited the baronetcy in 1907, and Lily had become, by the automatic machinery of British title, the wife of a baronet. The title was modest by the standards of the world she had once inhabited, the world of princes and dukes and the owners of great estates, but it gave her something she had not possessed since childhood: a social identity that was simply stated, legally conferred, and owed nothing to scandal, nothing to Bertie, and nothing to the portrait that still hung in Jersey Museum. Jean-Marie, meanwhile, had grown into an adult whose life was permanently shaped by the circumstances of her birth and permanently shadowed by the silence that had surrounded it. She married, Malcolm Ian Malcolm was her husband, and she had children of her own, and she lived a life that the biographical record treats with considerably less attention than it gives to her mother. That disparity of attention is itself a consequence of the concealment that had defined her earliest years. The effort to keep Jean-Marie out of the public story had been so successful that even the historical record struggles to place her fully within it. The confusion about her paternity persisted throughout her life. It surfaced in family conversations, in the stories that were passed down through generations, with the inconsistencies and contradictions that attend all family oral history, but that were in this case compounded by the deliberate obfuscation that Lily had imposed at the beginning. When Jean-Marie's own obituary appeared, decades after her mother's death, the question of who her father had been stumbled through the text with the same uncertainty that had attended her entire existence, a question never settled, never fully abandoned, simply carried year after year, like a weight that could not be put down because it had become part of the person carrying it. Lily Langtry died on the 12th of February 1929 in Monaco. She was 75 years old. The death was not sudden. She had been declining for some time. The body that had once drawn crowds at the Royal Academy and police to gallery doorways, finally yielding to the ordinary attritions of age and the accumulated toll of a life lived at extraordinary velocity across 2 continents and 5 decades of public performance. She had outlived Bertie by nearly 20 years. She had outlived Ned by more than 30. She had outlived most of the men who had defined the early chapters of her story: the prince, the husband, the painters, the impresarios, the solicitors who had managed the machinery of discretion. And in outliving them, she had achieved something that none of them could have predicted. She had survived long enough to become the author of her own legend, the final narrator standing, the woman whose version of events would shape the public memory because there was no one left to contradict it. The return to Jersey required arrangements that were themselves a final echo of the logistical complexity that had characterized her entire life. Her body was transported from Monaco across France, across the Channel, to the island where she had been born, a journey that reversed in death the trajectory she had followed in life. There were delays, as there always are when the mechanics of international transport meet. The bureaucracy of death certificates, customs regulations, and the particular formalities that attend the repatriation of a body from one country to another. The journey was not simple, but the destination was never in doubt. She was going back to St. Saviour, back to the parish where the dean had presided, where Emilie Le Breton had taught her daughter, without words, that beauty could move a room, and where the young Lillie Le Breton had looked at the horizon and decided that the island was not large enough for what she intended to become. She was buried in the churchyard at St. Saviour. The woman who had made herself everywhere, London, New York, San Francisco, Monaco, the race courses, the theaters, the advertisements, the portraits, returned to where she had begun. The grave is there now, marked and maintained, visited by people who know the story and people who do not, in a churchyard on an island that is still small enough that the horizon is always visible. The cultural afterlife of Lillie Langtry proved as durable as the woman herself, a testament to the enduring fascination of a story that resists the clean categories the public prefers. Francesca Annis first played her in the 1975 television serial Edward VII, a performance that introduced Langtry to a generation that had not known her name and framed her, as most adaptations would, primarily through the lens of her relationship with the prince. 3 years later, Annis returned to the role in the 13-part ITV series Lily, broadcast in 1978 by London Weekend Television, which traced the arc from Jersey to London to the stage with a thoroughness and an intimacy that earned Annis a BAFTA for Best Actress. The series did what television does best with this kind of material. It made the private life visible, gave the interior experience a face and a voice, and allowed audiences to feel what the historical record could only document. It also, inevitably, compressed and simplified. No dramatization can hold the full weight of a life, this complex, without making choices about what to show and what to leave in shadow. And the choices that Lily made tended toward the romantic and the glamorous at the expense of the commercial and the strategic. Earlier and looser screen treatments had placed Langtry in the frame, without making her the center. Lillian Bond played her in The Westerner in 1940, Ava Gardner in The Life and Times of Judge Roy Bean in 1972. These were cameo roles, supporting appearances in stories that belonged to other people, and they reflected a particular phase of the Langtry legend, the phase in which she existed in public memory primarily as a beautiful woman associated with powerful men rather than as a figure whose own trajectory was the more compelling story. In print, the biographical record has oscillated between romance and revision. James Brow's The Prince and the Lily helped establish the popular version of the Bertie Lily story, glamorous, romantic, shaped by the assumption that the affair was the center of the narrative and that everything before and after it was prologue and epilogue. Laura Beatty's Lily Langtry, Manners, Masks, and Morals, push back against that framing with archival specificity, complicating the legend with the kind of detail that reveals the labor beneath the glamour and the strategy beneath the beauty. Jane Ridley's biography of Bertie placed the Langtry affair within the broader pattern of royal liaisons, useful for understanding what Lily meant to the prince, which was one companion among many, rather than what the prince meant to Lily, which was something altogether more consequential and more complicated. The adaptations and the biographies share a common limitation. They tend to end the story with the affair, or with the stage debut, or with the first American triumph, as though the subsequent decades were an afterword rather than the main text. The real story, in the longer, harder, more interesting story, and everything that came after the portrait was hung and the prince moved on. What remains now is strikingly concrete for a life built so largely on surfaces, a life that had been, in many of its most important dimensions, a performance designed to conceal what lay beneath. The blue plaque survives at 21 Pont Street on the Cadogan Hotel in Chelsea, the address that had marked Lily's transition from royal-adjacent celebrity to self-sufficient professional, the house where she had lived on her own terms, with her own money, in rooms she had furnished with the earnings of a career that polite society had never quite forgiven her for pursuing. The plaque is small and simple, the standard English heritage blue ceramic disc, and it says what all such plaques say: a name, a description, a set of dates. It does not mention the Prince of Wales. It does not mention Jean Marie. It does not mention the Paris Room, or the Lakeport Courthouse, or the Genock Valley Ranch, or the trade cards, or the Haymarket debut, or the fire in New York. It says what it needs to say and trusts the viewer to know or to discover the rest. A Jersey Lily, the Millet portrait that had started everything, the painting that turned a woman into an image and an image into a national phenomenon, hangs in Jersey Museum and Art Gallery, in the building that now serves as the island's principal repository of its own cultural history. The portrait is smaller than you might expect if you know only its reputation. The woman in it is younger than you might imagine if you know only her later story. Younger than the actress, younger than the producer, younger than the racehorse owner, younger than the woman who stood in a California courthouse and dissolved a marriage that had been dead for 15 years. She holds a lily. She looks out with an expression that has been read across a century and a half as everything from innocence to calculation to the studied blankness of a woman who already understood that being looked at was a transaction and that the terms of the transaction were hers to set. The painting is the beginning of the story. The grave, 2 miles away in the churchyard at St. Saviour, is the end. Between them lies everything the portrait could not show, the whole complicated, exhausting, remarkable, costly life. In California, Langtry Farm still trades on her name, and the Gwinnett Valley wine landscape remains connected to the history she brought to it, a piece of Victorian celebrity embedded in American soil, producing wine under a label that carries the echo of a woman who bought the land, with money earned on stages and in advertising deals 3,000 miles from the nearest vineyard. The ranch has outlasted the scandal, the fame, the marriages, the horses, and the woman herself. It is perhaps the most fitting monument of all, a piece of property, deeded and durable, generating value long after the glamour that purchased it has faded into historical memory. Lily would have appreciated that. She had understood, from the moment the peer's testimonial first turned her face into a commodity, that the most reliable form of wealth was the kind that did not depend on being young, or beautiful, or loved. And in the churchyard at St. Saviour, the grave, Jersey ground, island ground, the earth that had produced a dean's daughter and that received 75 years later a woman who had been a beauty, a mistress, a mother, a scandal, an actress, a producer, a landowner, a racehorse breeder, an advertising pioneer, and a baronet's wife. The headstone bears the name. The ground holds the body. The story belongs to everyone who finds it. Lillie Langtry's story is not really about whether she loved a prince or used him. It is about what a woman had to become in order to survive a world that wanted her visible, but not autonomous, desired, but not powerful, famous, but not free. She learned, earlier than most, that beauty could be converted into capital and notoriety into leverage, but the conversion was not clean. It ran through secrecy, through a broken marriage, through a child born under concealment and raised inside silence, through years of being looked at before she was fully heard. There is no neat moral in that. There is only the image that survives. The Jersey lily in the museum, the plaque in Chelsea, the grave in St. Saviour, and behind them a much harder life than the portraits ever admitted.